The release of the 11 Nigerian soldiers should have ended the story. For most audiences, it looked like a quiet resolution, a diplomatic gesture, a return to normal. But in regions shaped by pressure and memory, events rarely end when the headlines fade. In Burkina Faso, the real story did not begin when the troops were detained. It began when an unauthorized aircraft crossed sovereign airspace in a region where every movement now carries strategic meaning. For a country that has buried too many civilians and soldiers because of hidden agendas and undeclared operations, there was no room for assumptions. Picture the moment inside Ouagadougou as alarms sounded and security units locked down key sites. This was not panic. It was procedure. For families living under constant threat, security is not an abstract concept debated at foreign capitals. It is the difference between another quiet night and another name added to a list of the dead. That is why President Ibrahim Traoré and his commanders did not ask whether the landing was inconvenient. They asked whether it was declared, whether it was consistent, and whether it respected the rules that now govern a new Sahel. Releasing the soldiers later was not a retreat. It was a calculated decision made after information was gathered and risks were weighed. Burkina Faso chose discipline over spectacle. But pause for a moment and consider this. If an aircraft can enter without authorization today, what enters tomorrow? Supplies, intelligence, pressure, or something far more dangerous? In a region where silence often hides intent, the absence of clear communication can be more alarming than open confrontation. This is why the incident mattered, not because of who was detained, but because of what the event revealed about the evolving contest for influence in West Africa. Before we move forward, reflect on this question. In an era where sovereignty is enforced not by words, but by procedure, who decides what is an accident and what is a test? What actually happened that day cannot be reduced to a single aircraft or a single explanation. To understand why Burkina Faso reacted the way it did, you have to place the incident inside a broader sequence of changes unfolding across the Sahel. In recent years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have moved away from a security model built on informal permissions and inherited arrangements. In its place, they are constructing a system where every movement is declared, verified, and justified. When the Nigerian military aircraft appeared without prior clearance, it triggered alarms not because of hostility toward Nigeria, but because it violated the very principle this new system is built upon. For Burkinabe commanders, the first concern was not mechanical failure. It was context. Why that route? Why that timing? Why the absence of advanced communication in a region where coordination has become mandatory rather than optional? Inside the operations center, analysts compared the flight path against declared routes, recent intelligence alerts, and regional activity patterns. What they saw raised enough uncertainty to require containment rather than assumption. In a region where armed groups and foreign interests have repeatedly exploited ambiguity, uncertainty itself is treated as a threat. The soldiers were detained not as enemies, but as variables that needed to be understood. This distinction matters. Burkina Faso did not mobilize for confrontation. It mobilized for clarification. Questioning the troops was part of a rapid assessment process designed to determine whether the landing represented an isolated technical issue or something more deliberate. At the same time, authorities considered the political environment. Tensions between ECOWAS and the Sahel states had already weakened trust. Statements from regional bodies had grown sharper, while behind the scenes, pressure campaigns intensified. In that climate, even routine actions acquire strategic weight. The decision to hold the soldiers temporarily sent a clear signal that Burkina Faso would no longer default to explanations provided after the fact. Sovereignty would be enforced procedurally, not emotionally. Once sufficient information was gathered and no immediate hostile intent was confirmed, the release followed. This sequence was intentional. By detaining first and releasing later, Burkina Faso demonstrated control over escalation. It showed that firmness and restraint are not opposites, but complementary tools. To outside observers, the release looked like closure. Inside Burkina Faso, it was confirmation that the state could manage pressure without losing discipline. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Borders are not symbolic. Airspace is not negotiable. Any deviation will be examined before it is excused. This approach reflects a deeper shift in how security is practiced in the Sahel. Instead of reacting after damage occurs, states are moving to prevent ambiguity from becoming leverage for others. For President Ibrahim Traoré, this moment reinforced a lesson drawn from years of instability. Weak states explain first and investigate later. Sovereign states reverse that order. They verify before they forgive. Yet this incident also exposed something else. It revealed how quickly a single unauthorized movement can ripple across alliances, markets, and diplomatic channels. Questions spread faster than answers. Rumors filled the silence. And in West Africa, silence rarely stays empty for long. It becomes a space where narratives compete and intentions are tested. That is why the release of the soldiers did not end the matter. It marked the moment when Burkina Faso confirmed that the real challenge was not the aircraft itself, but the environment that allowed such uncertainty to exist in the first place. And that realization pointed toward a larger confrontation that no single explanation could fully contain. The moment the aircraft was detained, reactions across West Africa exposed how fragile the regional balance had become. In Abuja, officials moved quickly to frame the incident as a technical emergency, emphasizing routine procedures and downplaying political significance. That response was predictable, but what followed was more revealing. Communication slowed. Clarifications arrived late. For several critical hours, silence filled the space where coordination should have existed. In a region shaped by decades of covert operations and undeclared influence, that silence carried weight. It suggested hesitation, internal disagreement, or an effort to control the narrative before facts settled. Inside Burkina Faso, this was interpreted not as reassurance, but as a warning. Public reaction within the country was firm and largely supportive. Many citizens saw the detention not as provocation, but as overdue discipline. For years, unannounced movements by foreign forces had been tolerated in the name of cooperation, often with devastating consequences. Villages were left exposed, intelligence was misused, and accountability disappeared behind diplomatic language. This time, the pattern was broken. Burkina Faso acted first, gathered information, and spoke later. Across the Sahel, the message resonated. In Bamako and Niamey, the incident was watched closely. Leaders and security planners recognized it as a test not only of Burkina Faso's resolve, but of the Sahel Alliance's cohesion. If one member could be pressured into hesitation, others would follow. Instead, coordination remained quiet, but consistent. No public fractures appeared. That alone altered calculations. Within ECOWAS, reactions were mixed. Official statements called for calm and dialogue, yet behind closed doors, concern grew that authority was slipping. Sanctions and warnings that once compelled compliance now carried less weight. The detention highlighted a shift from a region governed by expectation to one governed by procedure. For Nigeria, the incident introduced an uncomfortable reality. Regional leadership could no longer be assumed. Access now required consent, not habit. This represented a psychological break as much as a strategic one. Nigeria remains a powerful actor, but power without automatic access loses momentum. For external observers, including the United States and European partners, the event signaled a deeper transition. This was not escalation in the traditional sense. No troops mobilized across borders. No threats were issued. Instead, authority was asserted through rules. That made the response harder to challenge without appearing to dismiss sovereignty itself. Media narratives outside the region quickly split. Some commentators accused Burkina Faso of overreaction. Others quietly acknowledged that the response reflected lessons learned from years of destabilization. What mattered most, however, was how the incident reframed expectations. Future movements would be scrutinized. Silence would no longer be tolerated. Explanations would be required before access was restored. The release of the soldiers, when it came, did not soften this message. It reinforced it. Burkina Faso demonstrated that it could detain without humiliation and release without retreat. Discipline replaced drama. This combination unsettled those accustomed to chaos as an entry point for influence. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the incident validated a broader strategy shared with Mali and Niger. Sovereignty must be enforced calmly to be sustainable. Overreaction invites intervention. Hesitation invites exploitation. The balance lies in controlled firmness. Yet the reactions also exposed rising tension beneath the surface. Rumors circulated about intelligence gathering, readiness testing, and alliance probing. Whether true or not, their spread underscored how little trust remained in inherited frameworks. In such an environment, perception becomes a weapon. Every movement is interpreted, every delay questioned. This is where the real escalation occurred, not in military posture, but in mindset. West Africa crossed a threshold where cooperation would no longer rest on goodwill alone. It would be built on verification. And once that threshold is crossed, it is rarely reversed. The region entered a phase where even small incidents carry strategic consequences. As the dust settled, one reality became clear. The detention and release were not the climax. They were the signal, a signal that the old rules were gone and that future tests would come not with warning, but with ambiguity designed to probe resolve. The question now facing the Sahel is whether this new discipline can hold when pressure increases and the next test arrives without notice. Once the immediate tension faded, the consequences of the incident began to surface where they matter most, in civilian life and political calculation. In Burkina Faso, control of airspace and borders is not an abstract display of authority. It directly affects how food moves, how aid arrives, and how families plan their days. More than half of inland trade routes in the Sahel pass through territories now governed by stricter rules. When an aircraft is detained or a route is questioned. Delays ripple outward. Fuel arrives late. Prices climb quietly in local markets. For households already stretched thin, even small disruptions are felt immediately. This is why sovereignty carries weight beyond symbolism. It reshapes daily reality. Politically, the incident strengthened domestic support for a firmer security posture. Many citizens interpreted the response as proof that Burkina Faso had learned from years of instability, when foreign movements were accepted too easily and accountability was absent. That memory is not distant. It lives in displaced families, empty villages, and the long list of names never fully explained. By enforcing procedure first and diplomacy second, the government signaled that those years were over. Yet this same firmness also raises expectations. When a state asserts full control, citizens expect tangible results. Security must improve not just in announcements, but on roads and in fields. Prices must stabilize. Services must reach remote areas. Sovereignty removes excuses. There is no longer an external framework to absorb blame when progress slows. This creates a narrow margin for political legitimacy. Early discipline builds trust. Prolonged strain erodes it. Regionally, relationships adjusted in subtle but important ways. Nigeria remained a partner, but the assumption of automatic leadership weakened. Coordination shifted from habit to negotiation. Within ECOWAS, the incident reinforced fears that enforcement tools no longer carried the influence they once did. Sanctions and warnings lost credibility when states proved willing to absorb pressure rather than comply. For neighboring countries, especially along the coast, uncertainty replaced predictability. They watched as Sahel states hardened rules and wondered how far that discipline would extend. Migration patterns also felt the effect. As borders became more controlled, informal movement grew harder. Communities that relied on seasonal crossings faced new barriers. Some areas became bottlenecks, concentrating trade and tension in equal measure. These changes rarely make headlines, yet they accumulate. Over time, they reshape social cohesion and political patience. For President Ibrahim Traoré and his counterparts, this is the defining challenge. Enforcing sovereignty builds leverage externally, but it multiplies responsibility internally. Every delay, every shortage, every misstep now points inward. The incident with the Nigerian troops exposed this reality. It showed that Burkina Faso could manage pressure calmly, but it also revealed how quickly control translates into expectation. The state has chosen a path where dignity is non-negotiable. The question that follows is harder. Can that dignity be sustained if economic and security gains lag behind public hope? History offers few examples where control alone secured long-term stability. It must be paired with delivery. As the Sahel enters this new phase, the real test will not come from foreign aircraft or diplomatic statements. It will come from whether ordinary families feel safer, more secure, and more confident about tomorrow than they did before. And if they do not, the pressure created by sovereignty itself may become the most difficult challenge to manage. From the perspective of the United States and its partners, the incident in Burkina Faso was not alarming because of what happened, but because of how it happened. For decades, American engagement in West Africa relied on a simple assumption. Access would be predictable. Coordination would be routine. Regional institutions would absorb friction before it reached a breaking point. The detention and release of the Nigerian troops challenged that assumption without triggering a crisis that Washington could easily respond to. There was no open confrontation, no legal violation to contest internationally, and no escalation to condemn. Instead, there was procedure, restraint, and an unmistakable signal that inherited privileges no longer applied. For U.S. planners, this creates a new operating environment. When airspace becomes conditional and movement requires explicit consent, response timelines stretch, intelligence sharing slows. Humanitarian and security operations must account for negotiation before execution. None of this prevents engagement, but all of it raises cost. Influence becomes something that must be maintained through continuous alignment rather than assumed through precedent. Allies in Europe see a similar challenge. Planning becomes harder in a region where access can no longer be taken for granted. Coastal states watch closely, aware that shifts in Sahel discipline could eventually affect trade corridors and maritime stability. What concerns Western capitals most is not alignment with rival powers, but the possibility that the Sahel is becoming structurally resistant to external leverage altogether. A region that enforces sovereignty through procedure rather than rhetoric is difficult to pressure without appearing to undermine the very rules that international order depends on. This explains the measured tone coming from Washington. There are no dramatic warnings, no sweeping policy reversals, only reassessment. Inside American policy circles, debate is already underway. Some argue that locally enforced sovereignty could reduce long-term instability by clarifying rules and responsibilities. Others warn that reduced flexibility increases the risk of miscalculation, especially during crises that demand rapid response. Both views converge on a single point. The old model of engagement no longer fits the emerging reality. For leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, this moment carries strategic significance. A disciplined assertion of sovereignty strengthens bargaining power, but it also places the region under constant scrutiny. Every action is read as precedent. Every restraint is measured for weakness. As global attention intensifies, the Sahel is no longer a peripheral concern. It is becoming a testing ground for how power, influence, and cooperation function in a world where access must be earned rather than inherited. And as that test continues, one question remains unanswered. When the next incident arrives, and it will this new balance hold under the weight of global expectations, or will pressure force a reckoning that reshapes the region once again? What this incident ultimately revealed is not a moment of tension, but a shift in responsibility. The release of the 11 Nigerian soldiers closed one episode, yet it opened a far more demanding chapter for Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel. By enforcing procedure calmly and then choosing restraint, the government demonstrated something rare in a region shaped by overreaction and exploitation. It showed that sovereignty can be asserted without spectacle, and that discipline can be more powerful than confrontation. But sovereignty also removes excuses. Once a state insists on controlling its airspace, borders, and decisions, it accepts full ownership of the consequences that follow. There is no longer an external framework to blame when progress slows or pressure builds. For President Ibrahim Traoré and his allies, this is the real test ahead. Control alone does not guarantee stability. It must translate into safer roads, predictable markets, and a sense of order that ordinary families can trust. Looking forward, several paths are possible. If the Sahel Alliance converts discipline into consistent delivery within the next year, it may establish a durable model of regional autonomy that reshapes West Africa for a generation. If coordination holds but economic strain persists, the region may settle into prolonged tension, stable on the surface, yet fragile underneath. The most dangerous path is internal pressure. When expectations rise faster than results, legitimacy erodes from within, not because of foreign interference, but because hope turns into frustration. History shows that sovereignty without performance becomes a burden heavier than dependency ever was. This is why the coming months matter more than the incident itself. Every decision will be read as a signal. Every delay will be measured against promises made. For those watching from the United States and beyond, the lesson is sobering. Influence in the Sahel will no longer flow through convenience or habit. It will require patience, respect, and an understanding that authority now rests closer to the ground. As you reflect on this story, consider what true stability means in a world where power is no longer granted by tradition, but earned through responsibility. Is order defined by control alone, or by the confidence of people who believe tomorrow will be safer than today? If you value justice, dignity, and the quiet work of leadership that protects families rather than headlines, keep watching the Sahel closely. Because the most important battles here are not announced in advance. They unfold slowly, through choices that will shape the region long after the cameras move on.